Hello, my name is James Ramirez. I'm an art director based in Los Angeles. I work predominantly in film and TV. I've worked on a lot of title sequences, main on ends, broadcast packages, promo work for different films or TV shows, and I have a very kind of diverse body of work. I like to be a part of the entire creative process. So whether that's, coming up with concepts or design or actual 2D, 3D animation, just helping creatively troubleshoot throughout the project is, I find, really satisfying, and it's kind of one of my strong suits. So I try to work and collaborate with people in ways that I can bring my strengths to the project and help figure things out. Over the years, I've again worked on such a broad range of things. I'd love to show my reel to look at some context of what those client projects are. And I've also included a bit of the process in it, so you can see some of the design phase or motion test to show how we get to those kind of shiny, beautiful pictures. So let's look at that, and then we'll talk about what we're going to talk about today. Cool. Now that you've seen some of my client work and some of my personal work kind of mixed in there with the process, I would like to talk about something a little bit different, which is over the past year, I really got into virtual reality. I kind of had some experiences at Last SIGGRAPH, getting to see some installations and short films that really blew me away. And I really wanted to experiment and test out some of these creative tools for myself. So it's been really interesting getting to explore things that are kind of out of my comfort zone, like drawing characters and environments in 3D in a very different way, where you're kind of drawing interactively around you. And it's been fun to learn that stuff, but it's also been interesting to try to figure out how to bring that into my normal workflow. So taking some of those virtual reality drawings or kind of creations, importing them into Cinema and rendering them with Redshift, and playing with kind of interesting rendering techniques and looking at kind of non-photoreal rendering styles. So I would love to take a look at my website to show you kind of some examples of the work that I've been doing. And then we can look at some scenes to dive in and look at some of the process that I've been working on, that workflow of integrating those 3D elements into Cinema 4D and Redshift. So here's my website. I have a section on my website, Pixel Adventures, and I made a new place for some VR explorations. And here you can see some of the renders that I've been doing, various levels of quality here, but just kind of playing around with different things and seeing what I can create. And so some of these are directly out of Quill, like this one here, and some down here at the bottom. So Quill is vertex color based, so it's very flat colors. There's no kind of lights or shading. It really is all just you shading things manually or coloring things. And so you can see the kind of the stark difference between bringing some of these out into Redshift with emissive materials and global illumination and shadows, and kind of how it changes the overall aesthetic of it into just kind of nice hybrid stylized looking stuff. So let's dive in and look how we can kind of create a couple of these things. All right, so here we are inside of Quill. Quill is a VR drawing and animation program, and basically you're using strokes to create kind of dimensionally, which is hard to tell in a 2D recording of this, but that you're drawing in depth. So you can kind of look all around you, you can draw in space. It's a really interesting approach to, like a creative tool that I haven't experienced in anything else, and it's the funnest I've had drawing in forever. There is a Quill theater, like if you go to the front page, and there is a lot of really cool artists who are making stuff, and I suggest you kind of check that out if you have a headset. But the fundamentals are that you are drawing with a sorry, hit the mic there. You're drawing with a stroke, and that stroke looks flat, but if we turn on mesh here, you can kind of see that it is actually, like a tube being extruded through space. And there are several different types of brushes. They're kind of like flat, there's cubes, and there's like, ellipses. And so as you're drawing, you just want to take into consideration, if you are like me going to be bringing this outside of VR, thinking about how you're building your characters and your environments so that translates the best over. So let's take a look at a couple of scenes here. So I have one that is an environment, which is, something that I wouldn't normally feel comfortable doing in 3D. Like I don't really do this kind of like environmental stuff, but inside of VR, I feel like it's such a just intuitive program that it's like giving me this kind of freedom to explore doing things like this. And it gives you so much freedom in just being able to, make quick adjustments and revisions, and being able to, make variations on things in such a quick way, make iterations, that it feels like such a fun experimental exploration process. And you're able to get these kind of different, viewpoints really easily, and feel like you're kind of macro or like a giant, and it's just a lot of fun to kind of experiment. So this is something that I normally wouldn't do, but it kind of feels like really fun to kind of explore inside of VR. And then the other thing that I've been doing is also characters. So if we look at a character here, characters are something that I've done a lot over the years, just kind of like 2D drawings, but I've never really delved into making them dimensional. So I'm not like a ZBrush artist or a sculptor or modeler, so I haven't tried to make these. But in VR, something about working volumetrically and just being able to like grab pieces and manipulate them has really made me feel more comfortable in kind of exploring this. And so it's been a lot of fun to kind of learn kind of techniques and figure out the best look for these kind of like stylized characters that I like doing. And in this instance, he's in a really kind of low poly, abstract landscape there. So what I would like to show is like exporting this outside of VR, bringing it into cinema, and rendering this in a couple of different styles just to show, that flexibility in what we're getting out of VR, but also, playing around with some different techniques in Redshift to get some cool renders. So before we go, though, we should look at a couple of things. One is your scene setup. So I have this broken out all into layers, and I've done this not only just for ease of like drawing and revisions, but also for, I think, kind of thinking ahead. I know I'm going to want to apply maybe slightly different materials to his skin versus his pants, or the edge of this gun here has some kind of like emissive quality, so that would be cool to apply a shader to that. So I try to keep everything separate that I know that I would want to apply different shaders to. So there, the gun, I have it as an FX layer, and then the other consideration would be trying to reduce down things that you don't need. So it's not going to bring over anything that is not visible. So if you like hid this, it wouldn't bring it over, but it is going to keep intact all of your other layer structure. So then if we bring this back to my hand and I go to our export, so if we look at exports, it's going to export it directly to where I have saved this, which is in my personal projects Quill folder. And I'm saving an Alembic. You can also do an FBX, either work, depending on if you have animation, we can talk about that too, but I'm not exporting animation with this, just looking at getting this out of here. So we're going to hit export, and there we go. So now let's jump into Cinema and look at what we can do with this inside of Cinema. All right, so we have a new scene. I have some nulls in here for some scene organization, keeping things tidy. And we're going to go to File, Merge, and bring in our Olympic file. And the two things you want to make sure, if it's an animation, you want to make sure it's at the same frame rate and scale. I found that setting this to 100 brings it in at a good size, and everything else is pretty much default. So there we go. We have our Quill objects now inside of Cinema. So if we drag this into our scene, we can see that there isn't any actual shaders attached to any of our geometry, but you do see that there is this vertex tag attached to everything. And actually, if we shift select this, you see that all that color information is actually being stored and it's there for us to access. So the next thing we need to do is figure out how to get this into Redshift. So first things first, let's switch out my layout to a Redshift layout that I have. So I have access to the shader graph and the render settings and render view. So I'm gonna hit play and start our IPR, change our renderer to Redshift. It's just set to the kind of default settings. There's nothing special going on there. And we're starting to see what our render looks like. So now if I create a new Redshift material, and let's call this our base material, just so that we know what we're working with, drag this onto our group, and it's going to assign it to everything that doesn't have a shader, which is everything. And so we'll click this, drag it over, and by pressing Shift C in the shader view, I can bring up this quick search, and I'm going to type in vertex, which is going to give us vertex attribute. And then I'm going to drag that to our object and apply that to the diffuse. And then we need to drag this tag into the attribute name. And now we have something that looks similar to what we had in Quill. So the other thing of note is if we want to go for that really flat look, we need to make sure that we turn off our scene default light. So right now we don't really see it, but if I were, there is reflection on the floor you can see here. So if I were to go to the material and lower or make the object more rougher so that the surface is glossy and the reflection is getting bounced around, you can see that there is this white light that is being reflected on everything, and that is coming from our default light. So if we go to the Redshift tab, integration, we can actually turn this off by checking that. If we hit refresh, it'll update that, but everything should also go black because now we have no lights in our scene. That's okay because we're going for that really flat look, so we're going to go and take our vertex attribute and attach that to our shader's overall emission color, which if you're using the standard render, you could apply that to the luminance. And in here, we're going to go to overall and set the emission weight to something greater than 0. So let's start with 1. So we'll see that we still have that glossy quality to our shader, but we just no longer have those extra highlights from the light that was in the scene. And we can see that we still have preserved all that color information. So now we're looking pretty good. Let's also create a camera from this view. And so let's move it into this group. And let's make sure everything is in the proper order and layer. We're going to call this Cam 01. And I wanted a camera for 2 reasons. Later on, I'd like to add in some depth of field and adjust that. But also, I'd like to change the focal length to something more extreme, maybe like 24 or even 18 to get this kind of wide field of view. I want to get something that's pretty low to the camera, or to the ground. And you'll notice that our environment is kind of hindering that a little bit. So we're going to switch to another view, perspective, and we can just switch to hidden line for a display. And let us, also, just since we're there, if you looked at the display, you'd see that it's all pink. That's from the default color on the vertex attribute. So you can change this from that to something, that isn't as crazy, like dark gray or something, just so you know. And I'm going to switch back to hidden line, and this geometry is cutting right through where my camera is, but since everything came over on its layers from my Quill scene, I can actually just grab only the environment and rotate this till we kind of find a composition that works for us and there isn't anything sticking up through the middle of the camera. That looks pretty good. And the other thing I will note is that the floor that I drew in Quill isn't a flat floor. It was from like some brushstrokes that aren't all on the ground. So the other thing we do is we can click on our environment object and by pressing C, convert it to an editable object. And then if we go to our quick commands in Cinema, we can press Shift C again and type polygon groups to objects. I can run that, and that's going to break apart that. If we troll this down, you'll see that now every single stroke that I drew for that environment is now accessible. So I'm going to select the top parent here and select all children, which is also right clicking and do select children. And I'm going to center their axis, which we could also do by Shift C. You can do center axis to model. Running that does the same thing. And now their pivots their pivots are at the center of all of the objects. We can go back to our move tool and select some of these troubled ones that are kind of like higher and just adjust them till it looks like we have kind of like a better floor plane there. I mean, you could even completely remove this and, you know, add in a custom landscape or something, you know, whatever you wanted, but we're just gonna go with this geometry for now. So that's looking great. We have our colors, we have a little bit of reflection. So the next thing would be to actually dial in each material's quality. You know, so like the gun is more plastic. There's that kind of like special effects layer that I drew on the end of the gun that would be cool to be emissive. And, you know, like his skin and his clothes should probably have a different, you know, reflection quality than the environment, let's say. So before we get going on that though, I would like to start adding in some lights. So although we're in a flat world and everything has that emissive quality, we can still add in some lights for some cool effects. So I'm going to twirl this environment back up and not worry about it right now. And then I'm going to add in a redshift light. We're going to work with area lights. So this first light, I'm going to move up and move further back in Z away from him. And then I'm going to put this in my lights group, again, keeping everything clean, color it, and we're going to call this our key light. And then we're going to duplicate, and then I actually want to make a new null object, which gets put at the center of our scene. And since our scene is all centered, that's great for us, and we can drag this and drop it into there. And now we have a cool way of adjusting our light around our character. And then we're going to call this, you know, maybe just like rotate. And let's just create 2 more copies of this, and we're going to do a fill light and a rim light. So this rim, I know for sure I want on the left side of camera so that it starts giving that. And we'll just look at each light. So I'm going to turn off the other lights and look at one at a time. So that rim, you know, we do have kind of hitting him from that side. Oops, I turned out the wrong one, sorry. Drag it around, you can kind of see that starting to define his profile and give some definition to him. I think actually we moved this floor a little too low. You could see below his foot there. And so the other quality I want to do to these lights is if we go to the properties on them, if I select all of them, I'm going to adjust all of them. There is a spread. So right now by default, the as a rectangle light, it's kind of emitting in every direction, like uniformly from that plane. But what we can do is almost give it like a cone, and it'll use the actual shape of the light and draw a very distinct shape. So we're going to knock them all down to like 0.5, and this rim, I actually want to make that a much more defined specific light. It's a very specific lighting that we're trying to get on them. So I'm going to make it bigger, and we can see it's almost like the size of him, and make it a little bit more narrow. And as we rotate this, just make sure that we're hitting just the right edge. So I think that's looking good. Let's turn off the rim light and go for our key light. And our key light, I think, would be good in the front. It's kind of like as our hero illumination, just to, I mean, I think for this lighting, we're going very mysterious, but we still need a little bit of definition in him. So I'm going to move it there, maybe back it off and move it up. And maybe it's rotating, cheating in a little bit towards him. And I think that this one really can be kind of a wider spread. I don't think it needs to be as tight. And then maybe this is kind of like a cooler color. And let's lower the opacity to like 15, just so that we're hitting a little bit of front objects. Last light is our fill. And this, you know, I'd want to contrast our rim, so I'm just going to rotate it to where it feels like it's in opposition to that light. And same thing for this one. I think we want to go a little bit narrow on him, so I'm going to drag his spread in and back him off a little bit, and then rotate him just so that he feels like he's illuminating that kind of back side of him. And he's even casting a little shadow on himself, so that's looking nice. And let's also lower and change the color of this one. So let's lower it down to maybe 20, and let's make it maybe like a warmer light, some kind of nice funky color. It's looking good. And that rim, I actually would like that to be kind of a much warmer tone to kind of contrast the cool colors that we're pushing into our scene. So turn everything back on, and now we have some kind of more dramatic lighting within our scene, but still kind of inheriting a bit of that flat quality from Quill. So things are looking good, but now you can see that we're starting to see some of this kind of reflection quality or reflective quality on our surface, and everything has the uniform quality. So I'm going to break this out into a couple of shaders and look at how we can adjust that independently. So let's make one I know is for that bright gun, so I'll call that effects, and I'll drag that to the FX layer. And I want another one for our environment, so we can kind of just give a more controlled diffuse to that. And we'll need one for his skin. I'm going to apply that to, I think the bro layer is him. Yes. And let's make a more matte shader that we can apply to pretty much all his other parts there. So I mean, we could actually, the easier way would be just to apply that to the top group, and it would apply to everything inside. And oh, one more, let's do like a glossy plastic for the gun. Cool, now everything has its own layers and kind of control it. The effects, we want that to have a much brighter emission so that it's affecting the surrounding parts around it and the ground, which is cool. The glossy for the gun, you know, we kind of want a more plastic feel on that, so maybe it's not as rough and it has much sharper reflections. His skin, we want to maybe not be nearly as reflective and much more diffuse. Same for the matte layer, really low and really big. And then, is that all of them? Did we adjust all of them? Did I do everything too fast? So that's cool. I think we're looking good. The environment is the last one that I didn't tweak. So let's, same thing with that, make it just super glossy. And actually, we can even tint this to be like a blue or warmer tone like that light, and it could cause some interesting highlights along the surface, especially if we don't make it as glossy. So that's looking cool. And the last big thing that I think we could add to this to make it still feel stylized but kind of push it even further would be some environment effects. So I'm going to add a Redshift object environment, and right away we don't see any changes, but what this does is allow us to go light by light. So let's actually make one more light so we can have like a cool cone. Spotlight would be great for that. Rotate it 90 degrees, move it up, make it bigger, which makes it more intense. And you can see, same thing, you know, turn off everything else and bring your light in just so you can see exactly where, actually we want our environment, see where that light is and how it's affecting your shot. So I think this would be cool if we had some like strong diagonal lines in the background. So maybe this is even, you know, more horizontal and kind of affecting our scene there. So if we go to the attributes on it and volume and set this to be like 0.1, we can start to see that volumetric effect coming into our shot. And I still think it isn't diagonal enough. So we could even rotate it a bit more. Maybe move it down. And maybe it's kind of further back behind him. And yeah, I think that, you know, starts to feel like something more mysterious as it hits bits and pieces back there. So it's cool. Turn back on our other lights now that we have that, and let us start to work on this environment. So now that we have something with volume in there, we can go to our environment settings and change our color. So let's say that we wanted this to be more of like a stylized kind of blue. And you can see that now instantly that white light has started to illuminate our environment, which is this color. So that's cool. And we have attenuation here. So that's how quickly that light falls off. So we can play with really low numbers here. So we can do like 0.01. You can see it started to cut in. If we do like 0.05, you can see it's like cutting in even more. I think let's start with that. And then we can also change the fog emission color. So with this, we could maybe make this more of like a cyan. And you'll see that that immediately fills our entire scene up. But what you'll notice, there is a height. So this is kind of probably more used for if there was like a murky lake or water or something. You could dial this up, you know, to like say like 150 and pick what height you would want that at to, you know, live at. So you could do something like this that would be kind of stylized, like he's walking in kind of some mist. But I kind of like the set into 0, which is just filling the entire scene and kind of making it look pretty cool. And back to that kind of mysterious quality. What if I just kind of push this to be more in the purples anyways? And maybe it's a little bit darker. And then you can play with your attenuation here. And you can see how quickly things are kind of like atmospheric perspective falling off into that fog. So if we lower this, you can see that we can kind of see back all the way to that landscape item that we rotated around. So that's pretty cool. And I think I want to keep that as much as possible. So let's just increase this until it's very slight. That's looking pretty good. Now, I think the last thing that would kind of add that more atmospheric effect with the volume is if we made this effects layer, which it really isn't standing out, even stronger. So we could make a redshift light, another area light, drag that into our lights, and let's call that mesh. And under its properties, well, we will go to general and change the shape to mesh, and then go back into our gun layer and drag that into there to point it into it. And we want to make sure that it's a visible light so that it stays in the scene. And then go back to its ray contribution, and maybe we give this a bit of a bump so that it really starts to add a glow into our scene. And now I think that that scene is looking pretty cool. So I think him being fully illuminated, like he isn't 100% blending into the environment, but it's kind of like where you want to dial that style filter like in. So it's like how much do you want to live in this world versus, you know, like another kind of look. So to immediately combat that, you know, the thing that is mostly driving that is the emission, right? So we could select our materials and turn the emission weight down. And you'll see that that was the base. Let's do the environment, his skin, the matte, and the glossy. And now you'll see that he really is inheriting that lighting from the scene and isn't giving off his own illumination anymore, and it's letting more of the kind of stylization of the lighting come through. Then you could really kind of dial in your light some more, like maybe that key light is a little low, so maybe that comes up. You know, and you can kind of just play with lighting and, you know, dial it in. So, and then the other thing that I wanted to talk about is like, now that, you know, you kind of got something that's pretty cool, let's do a render real quick. So I'm actually going to save. We haven't saved. That's pretty important. So I'm going to hit save. and call this the same file name as the Alembic. And let's set our output resolution to 1920 by 1080 and hit Shift R to render that to the view, picture viewer. Actually, that isn't what I wanted. I'm kidding. I just wanted to hit render over here so that we could have it in the render view. I'll double click that so that it goes full screen. And we can see our buckets. So one note is, before I move on to the next step, is that mesh light does get a little noisy. I'm going to save this to the thumbnails down there, snapshots. And we could fix that. You know, like I said, we didn't adjust any of the settings. Actually, we've left everything at pretty much default. So we could bring this up to like 3264 as a base setting, and then you could go in and override the light and volume and increase these to, I mean, minimum 128. You could go higher, 512 if you really wanted to get rid of all the noise. And then let's see what that looks like. And the other thing is, we're not also using GI in this, so that could add another level to it, to where we're getting some of that bounce light within, like, you know, some of his color bleed from his shirt onto his skin and that kind of stuff. So that is looking much better, cleaner than our last image, and we can save that and compare. You'll see that we've gone from 9 seconds to 20 seconds, but we have a almost final image. We can turn that off, and the last step I wanted to show was adjusting over here under the settings. You could play with LUTs, so you can add in a LUT. I've been messing around with this like Fujifilm, like Fuji Color Pro. Is really nice. It really lifts the blacks and kind of desaturates it a little bit, gives it a nice look. Bloom is also fun to kind of add. You can adjust the threshold of how much that kicks in and how soft it is. I didn't do bokeh. I forgot to do that. Let's show that real quick. But you can see how that's like kind of starting to create like an interesting kind of look without even leaving cinema, which gets even better in the newer version, where you have looks and then you can do some like really cool presets there. So quickly, let's just switch back to IPR, and I'm going to add a tag to our camera for Redshift, camera tag. And then we can go to bokeh and override and enable this. And so if we go to a perspective viewport, you'll see that our focus point is kind of way back there. We just want to make sure that we drag that in to where we want, which is, you know, somewhere about the middle of our character. And then you can turn up the radius to kind of enable some of that depth of field action. You know, the more extreme you go, the, you know, more miniature it looks. So somewhere around 5 or 6 is probably good for this scene scale. And then the cool thing is that you can add in a custom image. So I like to bring in different bokeh shapes and play with that. So here's like a 6-sided offset color RGB, and make sure that you set it to normalization white color sum so that it doesn't affect the overall quality of your render, the luminance values. And then basically what that'll do is kind of do this nice diffringing along highlights. So wherever you get kind of blown out elements, you'll get this nice bokeh effect. So again, we'll hit render one more time, and we'll have our final of this. And then we can look at another Quill scene that I made that has some animation. So we'll look at bringing some of these same techniques into that scene, and then just looking at how using some scripting in Cinema that somebody else made that I just found and stole, how to loop Alembic files. All right, so we're back in Quill with the scene that I left open, and I want to go to open. I want to open another scene. So I want to show you this scene, which has animation in it, which is, this scene, which has animation in it. If I press enter, it'll start animating. So we did kind of like a Dark Crystal weird reference where I have this magical powers beaming down from the sky, and we are gathering essence from this magical tree stump. into each of these characters, and each of these characters is getting this kind of stream with animated bits going towards them, and they're happily absorbing them into their system somehow, floating dramatically in space with some kind of like low quality trees, bushes, grasses to kind of fill out the environment, and rocks around them. So this is looking cool. So let's look at how I set this up in my timeline, just so we can look at how we're going to export this. So if I stop it and go back to the beginning, what I decided to do is work at 24 seconds. And when you're exporting things outside of VR and bringing it into cinema, I mean, in Quill, there's kind of an automatic loop happening through this kind of loop function. So it hits the frames that you've animated and loops, but we're going to need to manually set that up inside of cinema. So what I've done is try to keep everything clean. I'm working at 24 frames per second. I have things that are animated on ones for 24 frames. I have things that are animated on, hidden my mic there. I have things that are animated on ones for 12 seconds, or 12 frames that are getting looped, and things that are on twos that are getting looped for 12 frames as well. So that everything is sticking within that kind of overall 24 frames. It's either 12 or 24 on ones or twos, and it's kind of broken out. Like I have each of the beams and everything separated out onto different layers, and then I also have the same thing for the characters. I went ahead and just simplified it by having each character being on their own layer, and they are also animated at 24 frames per second on ones. Great. This is all set up. Now we can go to export. We're going to export this again. It's in the same place where I'm saving my other file, and the file name is the same as the Quill scene tree stump powers, not Trump. And format is Alembic, and we're going to make sure that we're going to also export the animation and hit export. Give that a second, and then we're good to go. So now let's jump back into cinema and take a look at setting up this scene. All right, so I went ahead and set up a new scene, importing our new Alembic file into this, and I brought over a lot of the elements that we've created. All of the materials that we made, I've copied and pasted those over. You could also add that to your content browser if you wanted quick access to those, so you don't have to remake them every time you're setting something up like this. I brought over our lights. The main difference is it did change the rectangles to spheres so they could sit behind the tree line a little bit better. And for the most part, everything else is the same. I've just kind of brought in the elements from the scene and applied the shaders accordingly to kind of give different material properties. We can hit play and see what some of these cameras are that I set up. So I set up a camera for each character. So it's kind of one, so we can kind of see what each of them look like. And then I also set up a couple of environment ones, like a top down, and then kind of like a wide establishing shot of the entire tree line. And so with that, the difference between these two scenes, right, is that this scene has animation. So if I start scrubbing through this, you can see that all of those layers come to life, and they're actually updating in our render preview. I'm going to pause that for a second. But you will notice is that they all animate and then stop at their respective animation that we brought in from Quill. So some of them, again, were on 12 frames, and some were at 24 frames of animation. So what I found for a workaround for making these loop, kind of like how we saw in Quill, is I found this tutorial from Philip Dollinger, who created a Python script to loop Alembic files in Cinema. So he has a download link here. I downloaded it, and it is in my downloads folder. If I double click this, we can see that it is a null with a Python script, and the Python script has a drag and drop the Alembic file onto here. And then on the actual node itself, it has some user data for the loop duration. So I'm going to copy this and press V to switch back over to our scene and paste it into here. So now I know that I animated some things at 12 and some things at 24. So I'm going to create two of these just right off the bat. And I'm going to have this top one set to 12 frames per second and this bottom one set to 24. And then let's start with one element. So I know the characters are set at 24 frames per second. So I'm going to grab this one, drag it down. An easy way of, keeping this separate, I'm just going to create one of these for each element that I want to animate. It's a little tedious, but once you have it set up, it's pretty quick. So we're just going to drag and drop, these characters onto there for each one. And then now, now, if I go to play, you'll see that our characters continue to move and loop. So that's exactly what we want. We just have to do that for the rest of our elements. So it looks like our effects here, the main blobs, the beam up is also at 24. So I'm going to create a duplicate of that and drag in that. And that will loop. And I think these little blips are 24 frames as well. So FX02, so we'll just create one more of those. And same thing, drag and drop. And now we have all of that animating. And I think the rest of these are at 12. So we'll drag this in and just make enough copies for everybody. And then again, with our tedious but amazing loop, just drag and drop each of these into our respective nulls. And then if we rewind and hit play again, we should see that everything is animating accordingly. And now we could, move our camera around, create some cool camera moves in our scene, and we were able to translate those like frame by frame, animations that we've brought in from Quill and create them inside of Cinema, which is really cool. And we could play again and see what that looks like. I could hit play. I think this is probably too heavy to get a real playback there, but get the point. The other thing is that since we do have, these more bright things going on, that kind of bokeh that we set up on the other scene, you can see that it does get some really cool fringing if you were to push that on some of these that have these like really bright moments. So it could find a spot where maybe there's like some white here. There you go. You can see like where that begins to, if I do a bucket render, you can see how that begins to get that defringing and color aberration from that custom texture that we brought in there. And I'm going to change my, well, it's almost done, but I would change my buckets to be bigger, but this is looking cool. And yeah, I think that's all I really wanted to show. The other thing is, I guess we still have our LUT settings. You could come back in here and turn on your LUT or, any sort of like color, stuff that you've done, color grading, and apply that as well. It's nice that it retains it from the last scene that we were working in. So it's cool that you could like seamlessly apply that across, multiple shots. All right, so that's it for this scene. And I just wanted to open up one more scene to just talk about a couple of nodes inside of Redshift that I've kept things pretty simple by just using the vertex attribute to drive everything, but I wanted to show a couple of nodes where you could add in some more variation, specifically just inside your nodes. So again, I have a shader set up with the vertex driving the emission and diffuse color, and I have a sun to add in some light and shadow. So with that, let's add in a couple of nodes just to kind of look at some different things you can do. So say you wanted to accentuate, like the overlapping of the objects or, their closeness of the strokes, you could add in an AO shader, which is cool. And one tip here is that under tools, connect node to output, I've mapped this to Control 1. So it's nice to be able to select any node and press Control 1 and get a, specific look at that node that you're working on without worrying about the rest of the tree. This is great for seeing the texture size, noise size, different variants within your nodes, and just kind of making sure you're dialing it into what you want. So here we have some, normal settings for AO. You can choose like how wide the fall off is, or how small it is, and the spread. You have different options of, how much, contrast you want within the element of the AO. So what we want to do though is, multiply this on top of our existing color information. So with that, we're going to bring in a color layer. And this color layer is really cool. It's like your kind of typical Photoshop layers where you're given some compositing options and blending modes to combine different sources and then have them masked or, interacting with each other to go back to your source input. So here we could take our vertex, apply that to our base color, and then apply that to our diffuse. And if I press Control 1 on our material to set that back to the output, you see that everything has gotten dark. That's because layer 1 by default is black and it's set to normal. So I'm going to plug the AO into layer 1, and we're going to see that now we see just that AO since it's set to normal, but our emission is still allowing it to get some of that color info. So we're going to set this to multiply. And now we've added in a little bit of some shading. So here you can, if I drag this mask down, we can just play with it and see how it's just adding a little bit of detail to the proximity, especially down here in the grass where things get close to each other in the ground. It's just adding a little bit of shading and detail to some of the crevices. So that's one way of adding in a little bit more detail. Something else that I think is cool to play with is the curvature node. If I type in curvature here, and again, press Control 1 to just isolate that, you can see that we get this cool, almost like toon-like shading. And what it's doing is based on the curvature of the objects, trying to isolate with black and white values the points that are rounded, right? So here we have settings under general. You can pick the radius of like how wide that line is getting or how narrow. And then you could, under remap, you have a lot of properties for controlling the contrast between those two values. So you could increase your minimum so that there isn't that much like gray values and it's more of just a really stark image. And you can do a lot of things with this. You could add this on top. So we could put this in our layer 2 color, and under layer 2, we could enable that and set it to, screen, and set our output back to our material so we can see how it's mixing. So that's pretty cool. Now we see that we have this white lines that are being added onto our object. So, you could make those black and you could have it almost feel like a toon line, or if, you could color it, you could add in a ramp, which is also a really cool node. So we apply this to our input and then put that as our 2 color. And then you can change the color here to make that any color that you wanted. So say you wanted some like edge detail or wear, this is a node that you could use to, really kind of get some interesting edge detail in there. And then with the ramp, you have much more control over, how that's looking, and also the color output of it. And then one last node that I'll bring up is the noise node, which is really great to have the Maxon noises inside of Redshift. So I can press Control 1 on this, and you can get your favorite types of noises that you like, and you have a lot of options down here for their scale. You can change it to be smaller, and then low clip will let you add a lot of contrast. And what's cool is then we could also apply this as the mask for those lines that we just added, and turn back our output to the material. And now you can see that those lines are much more broken up, and you can kind of just play with your settings to get some more kind of creative, interesting mixture of how those lines are getting masked in. So there's a couple of nodes that I quickly ran through, but I think they're kind of really powerful and add to that whole shading dynamic that you can do. And I mean, the beauty of a lot of these is that, you can kind of plug and play things, see the results, see how they're affecting it, and see, if they're helping you towards your overall goal towards the image that you want. So yeah, those are just a few things that we could add. Again, I feel like this is just kind of the foundation, and you can kind of keep adding and making it really cool and unique to however you want it to look. Cool, so that wraps up everything that I would like to share. It really feels like a good starting point of things. It feels like you could bring in so many different elements with this. You could bring in mega scans or turbo squid models of like, realistic elements or grass, and build out really cool scenes using the cloner and duplicating objects. It feels like this is like a foundation to build upon, and there's so much more exploring, experimenting to do. I look forward to doing more and sharing that process with you. You can find me on Fried Pixels across all social media platforms, Twitter, Instagram, and on YouTube. I also have some free tutorials on there. And I hope that you enjoyed this, you learned something, and if you're working in virtual reality, it helps you bridge the two things together and gives you some fun things to play with. Thanks again to Maxon for having me. It's a pleasure to share my work and some of these things with you, and I look forward to talking to you.